let's dive a little bit into the weeds, the data, the details around the likelihood, the impact, the cost to help you figure out, can I just shoulder this burden alone? Can this just come from my emergency savings? Or could it come from somewhere else? What do I need to know if I'm potentially even considering this type of cover? Firstly, you're going to need to apply for it. So you're going to have to go through that underwriting process that I mentioned up in episode 1 of this mini-series. But as I said, the most common claim that I ever saw for trauma insurance was around cancer. And using this cost of care report, which is from Zurich, volume 2, they say that cancer was the leading cause of death and terminal illness for women and men, and the leading cause of trauma and health events claims for men and women, representing more, I think it's meant to say more than, but it just says more. 3 in 4 trauma claims were for women. Wow. Get this, and this probably should have gone in the episode we did before, but it said cancers were also the leading cause of TPD claims for women and the second most common cause of claims for men, which is based off their claims in 2022. So obviously these are quite severe, I would imagine, cancer diagnosis where it is rendering them unable to work again. So you can see how this can interplay with both trauma insurance and total and permanent disability. Now, if you had all of these packaged in one policy, we sometimes call these riders. I think of it almost as did you ever watch The Two Fat Ladies, or was that just me and my English grandmother, where there was a lady who had a bicycle and then she had the other lady on a cart on the side and they would go around and cook? They were fabulous. I wish they were still around to do it again. It was a cooking show. It has nothing to do with insurances. But if you think about the cute lady, I forget her name, that was in the cart, she was like the rider. I know, the examples my brain spits out should be studied. So if you think about how this works, often what you'll have is life insurance as the main motorbike, if you will. And then the rider benefits sit as the little carriages, I don't know what those things are called, on the side. So if you had a life insurance policy and you had total and permanent disability and trauma insurance as rider benefits, I'm doing inverted commas, you can't necessarily claim on all of them. So if you claim on your trauma cover, in most instances, it will reduce your total and permanent disability by the same amount. So let's say you had $200,000 of trauma cover, you had $1 million of life insurance and total and permanent disability cover, TPD. If you got paid out your $200,000 from a cancer event from trauma, normally what will happen is it will reduce your life and total and permanent disability contract by that $200,000. So that $1 million turns into $800,000. Now, for some, but not all contracts, they will have something where after 12 months, potentially, it comes back. So you go back to $1 million. Not always. If, however, you have life and total and permanent disability as one policy, so the total and permanent disability is a rider, it's sitting on the side like that cute lady. One of them's name was Jennifer. I'm sure of it. I just don't know which was which, but let's presume, I think Jennifer was actually riding the motorbike. Anyway, the other one, that's your TPD, that's riding. If you have what's called standalone trauma insurance, you pay more premiums because it doesn't interact with the other policies. So let's say we use that example. You have a standalone trauma insurance, you have a life insurance and a rider benefit of TPD for $1 million. You claim on your trauma insurance for $200,000, you get paid out the $200,000. Now, because it was a standalone contract, it wasn't a rider benefit to your life or TPD, they didn't reduce. They are still $1 million. If then it is somehow decided that you are totally and permanently disabled, because as I'm just reading, it was a large portion of claims for cancer that are paid out for TPD, you wouldn't be paid out the $800,000 because remember, it hasn't reduced. They're not interacting with each other. You'd be paid the full $1 million, assuming that you meet that definition. So there are also things in terms of how you structure it and what you need to be careful of from a risk perspective and whether you can, it's called a buyback, whether you can buy back cover after you claim or not, that needs to be thought through. Again, this is why you want someone to help you bloody do it, because how are you meant to know all this stuff? Your prob's not. So cancer and the financial impact of cancer it's pretty considerable. So this is what has come out of the Cancer Council Australia 2022-2023 pre-budget submission. It says the financial impact of cancer on households is growing at an estimate of 6.8% per annum, with out-of-pocket costs continuing to be felt by cancer patients beyond their initial diagnosis and treatment period. Now, I don't know if that is just because during that time we had a high inflationary period of around 7%, but if it is 6.8% cost burden increase year on year, which is far, far greater than inflation, far greater than wage growth, you can see that this is a very, very big cost. And as someone who had stage 4 endometriosis taken out earlier this year, I think I've already talked about this on another episode. I did not meet a definition of trauma, despite the lovely lady on the claims call trying to see if she could get me a claim paid. I had $8,000 out of pocket, I think, or $10,000. It was a huge amount of money just for my surgery, let alone the impact to my business and my income, because remember that would be income protection. But there was all of the other ancillary costs. I went back into hospital 3 times. The third time I had to have emergency tests, and I did it privately because that's what my surgeon wanted, because he wanted me to had to figure out what the hell was going on that day. Those tests alone, CT, ultrasound, I had emergency blood tests. I feel like they were all. That day, that Friday morning where they found what was going on, I had a bowel obstruction post-surgery. That in itself was another $1,500 just that day, just those tests, not covered by private health cover. So I didn't even suffer one of these quote-unquote traumatic events, although let me tell you, I would disagree with that definition. There was considerable costs. So if you have something like cancer, I can't even imagine the other costs. God knows how many hundreds, if not thousands of dollars I spent at the chemist, going back to my GP and having to pay the out-of-pocket costs there, booking back in to see my surgeon. Like, there are just so many costs that you don't think about. I was able to drive. Other people cannot. They're not well enough to drive. They have to get taxis or Ubers. They might need to ask a friend to take time off work. Like, there's just a lot of costs that you want to think about. So apparently in 2023, 165,000 Aussies were diagnosed with cancer. The most common were prostate, breast, melanoma, and bowel cancer. Let's kind of give you a bit more detail because it can actually vary quite a bit. And I realize it's a little bit morbid, but I think knowledge is power. And I'd rather you have more than less knowledge when it comes to insurances. Okay, so I believe the most commonly claimed cancer in trauma insurances is for melanoma, which is skin cancer. There are 3 different types: basal cell carcinomas, squamous cell carcinomas, and melanomas. If you look at a trauma contract, you'll see there are probably 3 different definitions. So they'll define each of those. And they may even have a partial element that is available for one, or maybe all of them. I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is what I mean in terms of you need to meet the threshold to be able to be paid out. If you have a melanoma, they just lump it all together as melanoma/skin cancer, which I don't know if that's right or fair, given melanoma seems to be its own one, because then they go on to say melanoma is the most dangerous form of skin cancer, but they have used melanoma as the heading, so I'm just going with what they've done. Sorry if this is not the wrong language. And I'm thinking of Anne Gately, and hello if you're listening, who I interviewed in another Financially Fierce episode, who actually had a melanoma and talked about her own journey, and she was insured and she talked about that from a personal perspective as well. But apparently the average OOP, which I'm assuming is out-of-pocket expense or price, per active treatment is $5,600 up to $7,680. I don't know how many active treatments you need to go through, but again, I had dinner at a friend's house last Friday night, and his mother has been quite sick with cancer for some time, and he said that they, I think maybe 17 years ago, 15 years ago, many years ago, were able to access this particular treatment that was not government funded yet. I think it may now be, but I'm not 100% sure. But it basically was $1,500 a week. And they were financially able to support that. But I hate the idea that if you didn't have that money, you were not afforded the option to live. Something about that feels extraordinarily unjust. And yet that is the reality. And like, maybe it's not, maybe you don't need to pay that now, but she certainly, from what he said, wouldn't be here now. And she still is. Had she not been able to cough up the cash, considerable amount of cash, that was just for that treatment. That didn't include any time off work or all the other things that she would have had to cover. Money, unfortunately, when it comes to health, buys you options. I think money buys you options in all areas of your life, but when your literal life is on the line, you don't want money to be the reason that you don't have the treatment that you would like, or that your family member doesn't have the treatment that you would like them to have. So look, if you look at melanomas, the precedence or the number of new cases is pretty high. It's 50 new cases a day. You could argue, okay, 5,600 to 7,600 per active treatment, whatever that means, is not a huge, like maybe people could tolerate that. Maybe. But then when you look at things like kidney cancer, there are 13 new cases every day apparently in Australia for that, as at 2023. The lifetime cost for that one is much, much more expensive, $72,390. And so again, like without knowing what the actual hell is going to happen to you, at what level, what your recovery is going to be like, what your private health is or is not going to cover, what your surgeon is or isn't going to cost, it is so hard to know whether you are going to have enough emergency savings, enough stuffed in your offset account, enough available in your redraw, or that you could draw out of your share market portfolio, which isn't ideal for many reasons. So you want to do the best with what you can, with also what your budget allows.